about the French presence in Trinidad, it does not actually include the French presence in Tobago, because the French presence in Tobago was very light on the ground. It came and went and was a result of various invasions and the repelling of invasions that came and went over the years in Tobago. Although, if you look at the map of Tobago, you will see a handful of French names, like Les Coteaux and some others as well, and Palatouvier, and perhaps one or two. The French presence in Trinidad and Tobago has to do with the French presence in Trinidad. Now, there's something that is very important to understand about Trinidad's historical development, and it is fundamentally this. Trinidad is not like Barbados and not like Jamaica, for example, that had a long European presence in those islands. In Barbados and in Jamaica and in Antigua, St. Kitts and some of these other islands, the European presence begins at the beginning of the 17th century. This is 16-something, or the end of the 16th century, which is like 1595. Now that's a very, very long time ago. In the case of Trinidad, Trinidad's, although it was a Spanish colony from its beginning when Columbus first came here on behalf of the kings of Spain, Trinidad did not have much of a population. You could imagine it being entirely covered by vast forests up until 1783, because the development, the social, political, commercial development of Trinidad begins in 1783. This is a long time after Barbados. And it begins very, very suddenly, and it begins very, very rapidly. In 1783, for example, the population of Trinidad had 126 white people. Now, 126 white people were mostly Spaniards. Some of them were not even too sure if they were white. They had been living here for several generations, and they were part of the Spanish administration, a part of the Spanish establishment in this part of the world. There was something like 295 free-colored people. This is mixed-race people, partly Spanish, partly African, mostly Amerindian. And there was something like 310 enslaved people. Now, what this really indicates is that there was no slave industry, there was no plantation economy being run by enslaved people. There was, however, an Amerindian population, a First People population that was a remnant population of about 2,700 odd people. So this was Trinidad in 1783. In 1783, the most significant and the most important event took place. And this was the publication and the proclamation of a document called the Cedula of Population of 1783. The Cedula for Population of 1783 was described by Professor Carl Campbell, head of history at Mona and at St. Augustine as well, as our first constitution. It was essentially a document that had to do with immigration, because what it did was that it outlined all the necessities, all the requirements for people coming to settle in Trinidad on one condition, and that is what they had to be Catholic, because it was Spain, and Spain was a Catholic country. So from the very beginning, this cedula of population defined the economic apparatus and the legal apparatus under which Trinidad would run. It was a result of the hard and difficult and unremunerative work of a Grenadian Frenchman by the name of Philippe Rome de Saint-Laurent, who, through his efforts and the collaboration of the Spanish government of the day, created this instrument for the population of Trinidad. So out of this very small population of people would eventually evolve into the Trinidad that we know today. Now, the thing about the Cedula of Population of 1783 was that it was a very unique, and some would say enlightened document. Because one of the most fundamental things about this immigration-based legal instrument was that it accommodated the free blacks and people of color of the Caribbean and invited them to come to Trinidad. Now, the condition of the economic world, the Western world, in that period of time was that all industry was driven by enslaved labor taken out of Africa, captured out of Africa, kidnapped out of Africa, sold out of Africa, and by far and away one of the great travesties of history was the African slave trade. The beginning of the fundamental aspect of the Cedula of Population was the distribution of land, where just about every free person who came to Trinidad got very large parcels of land, some 32 acres per person, and a certain amount for the slaves that they brought. So it had to do with essentially slavery. It had to do essentially with the parceling out and the distribution of land for the cultivation of sugar estates, cocoa, indigo, cotton to some degree, tobacco, and so on. So fundamentally, this is what it was. One of the more, or perhaps it could be argued, the most significant clause in the Cedula of Population was this one. It is Article 4 in the Cedula, and I will read it very quickly. Because, you see, the French presence in Trinidad is a little broader than the 200 or 300 French people who came to Trinidad. Because the French presence in Trinidad had a lot to do with the several thousand black people, mixed race people, who came out of the French islands to Trinidad. And Article 4 says this, and this reverberates down through history, and we'll come to it as well. The free Negroes and mulattoes who shall come to settle in the said island in quality of inhabitants and chiefs of families shall have half the quantity of land granted to the whites. And if they bring with them slaves, being their own property, the value of land granted to them shall be increased in proportion to the number of said slaves. To the land granted to the said Negroes and mulattoes, that is 1/2 of the quantity granted to the slaves of the whites. And their titles shall be equally legal and granted in the same manner as the Europeans. Now, this doesn't sound like anything remarkable or outstanding or even particular when we hear it from the perspective of today. But at that time, when this document was promulgated, it was a unique and very particular gesture and recognition of a class of people, black people, colored people, who would come to Trinidad. There would not be another document like this that would have this sort of accommodation until one was done in Puerto Rico, perhaps about 30 or 40 years later. This was, in essence, a document that comes out of the age of enlightenment. People were getting a better understanding of things. The development that took place in Trinidad between 1783 and 1797, that saw the British conquest, was a significant development. The white French planters who came, and there were no more than 200 or 300 of them at the most, developed sugarcane estates in and around Port of Spain, and then gradually along the shoreline of the Gulf of Paria in what is now places like Caroni, and going south all the way down to the Naparimas, and beyond that into Guapo and around the Pitch Lake and so on. There was a rapid development. They brought in slaves that they possessed, they developed this land, and it was quite a rapid development, estate development. What is not often mentioned in history is that the 6,000 or 7,000 free blacks and people of color who also came to Trinidad in that period, they too, according to this piece that we just read, that article number 4 that we just read, they too brought in vast quantities of enslaved labor as well. And they were centered largely in the Naparimas, in the areas around San Fernando, going east and further down south. So the development of Trinidad took place essentially by these two groups, the European French people on the one hand, and the free blacks and people of color on the other hand. Both groups were involved in agriculture, both groups were deeply involved in slave labor, buying, selling human beings, because that was the nature of the times. By 1797, which was just a few years later, the British arrived in Trinidad, and after a very short encounter with the Spanish, who had no troops on the ground and had very little way of defending themselves, what took place was the capitulation of the Spanish government and the beginning of the period of British colonization that will last from 1797 all the way on through to 1962 when we become independent. Now, the first English governors, General Picton, Monroe, Hislop, they were military men. They were here largely from the point of view of preventing Trinidad from being overwhelmed by the Spaniards who lived in Venezuela, or overwhelmed by the French revolutionaries who lived and operated out of the French islands in the Windward Islands. They didn't care so much about the development of Trinidad from a civilian point of view. The first civilian governor that we had was a man called Sir Ralph Woodford. He was a young man and he was a very energetic person. He came here in 1813, which was a very interesting time, because one of the significant things that had happened at that point in time was that the abolition of the slave trade had taken place. That meant that no more free labor could be imported out of Africa into Trinidad by the French planters or by the colored planters themselves. What Woodford wanted to do, what Woodford felt that there was a necessity to do, was to bring some kind of order to the place. And in a very quirky way, he targeted the free blacks and people of color who were largely embedded in the French community in Trinidad. This was his essential target. The first thing that he did was that he moved against them from the point of view of they were not allowed to be addressed as Mr. They had to carry a light if they walked out at night, and they were not allowed to practice their professions. But the crux of the matter came, of course, when he moved against them from the inheritance of property. That triggered, again, another remarkable individual who came out of this Afro-French community. And this remarkable person who came out of the Afro-French community was a man called Jean-Baptiste Philip. He was a Naparima planter. He had Philippine estate. His father and his relatives had Concord estate, and he was a very wealthy, well-placed man. He had been educated in England. He was a doctor. He was in his very early 20s, and he challenged Woodford on behalf of the free blacks and people of color who were mostly of a French background. He took his case to the House of Lords, where he didn't publish it, but he put about a book that was called The Free Mulatto, where he defended in that book the rights and privileges of not only the free blacks, a very simple but very important point. When the English conquered Trinidad in 1797, they had accepted legally all the terms in the cedula of 1783. It was ratified in the Articles of Surrender. So, Article number 4, which is what I read to you, that has to do about inheritance, was a very important part of his argument. In March of 1829, the government in England, in London, Parliament, they issued a law which abolished all disabilities to which Her Majesty's subjects of European birth or descent were not subject. This was to grant full legal equality between whites and free coloreds in Trinidad. Now, this was a very significant and very important document that the French and Afro-French community had put forward to the British government. It was a very strong argument, and it was upheld in the highest court of the day. It is quite possibly the first civil rights case that was fought and won for the New World in a superior court. The result of that, the result of this, was that Trinidad developed socially and politically in a far more advanced and upwardly mobile manner than many other colonies in the British Empire of the day. It gave rise to both the white French people and for the colored people and black people who were free people to rise in the civil service, to rise in the militia, to rise in the police, to practice their professions. And in truth and in fact, you can say that it was the basic ground from which the Trinidad middle class, this is the colored black middle class, the colored black intelligentsia of Trinidad, together with the French and other European people who were here. This is where one can say that nascent nationalism formed itself. It was a remarkable and significant move that was made by Jean-Baptiste Philip. So there were therefore two significant people who worked for the creation of what becomes modern Trinidad. One was a Frenchman by the name of Philip Rome de Saint-Laurent, who created or had this document, Cedula of Population, brought into existence. And the other one was 40 years later or so, was Jean-Baptiste Philippe, who was an Afro-French man. And this is the foundation for Creole Trinidad. Because by that time, there were no Indians living here. Indians were to arrive in 1845, several years later. The effect of the emancipation of slaves in Trinidad effectively put the French plantocracy out of business. It also effectively put the black and colored planters out of business. It was several years later when, in a different dispensation, a different world, one could say, in the 1870s and 80s, chocolate was invented in Europe. And it was discovered that in Trinidad, we were able to produce some of the finest chocolate in the world, cocoa in the world. And it was here that the French Creoles, and to some extent, some of the black and colored people who had come out of the French background were able to resuscitate themselves and remake their fortunes, so to speak. And this was the cocoa boom. This generated, and it was driven mostly by the French Creoles. And this cocoa boom was a trickle-down economy, because people, whether they had a small plantation of 10 or 15 acres, or whether they had a large plantation like the Cadbury companies of several thousands of acres in Blanchisseuse and so, were able to make a lot of money. It gave rise increasingly to a middle class. All of this is what contributes and formulated itself into the creation of what is known as Creole Trinidad. It gave rise to an intelligentsia. It gave rise to cultural aspects like carnival, and I saw outside part of the display had to do with Blue Devils of Paramin. It had to do with the Calypso culture. It had to do with the Jamet culture of East Port of Spain. All of these cultures that came about, Carnival and the Jamet culture and the Blue Devils and all of that were forms of resistance to British colonial rule. The significant thing is that although the numbers were very, very small, at the beginning of the 19th century, for example, there were 1,093 men, women, and children of French descent in Trinidad. There were 2,925 free-colored people of French descent in Trinidad, a total of about 3,200 people or something like that. And it is out of that that the French influence gradually grew to become a significant influence that lasted way into the 20th century. Buttressed by Catholicism, supported by the cocoa industry, these two cultures produced remarkable individuals out of the two significant schools of the day, St. Mary's College and QRC. These were the incubators of an intelligentsia that went forward and shaped modern Trinidad in very many ways. In closing, I will tell you this. The French community, in its last effervescent years of the early part of the 20th century, was able to produce an outstanding labor leader. It was able to produce a remarkable aviation pioneer, and it was also able to produce a scientist who created the cobalt radiation treatment for cancer. The first was Arthur Cipriani, the second was Michael Cipriani, and the third was Andre Cipriani. And one could say that in many ways, their work and their endeavor could sum up the achievement and the contribution of the French community to Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you very much.